Girl Scouts vanished without a trace in July 1996. For 13 years, their families lived with an unbearable silence, clinging to hope that somewhere, somehow, their daughters were still alive. The search had consumed every resource, every lead, every prayer. But the forest kept its secrets buried deep. Until the morning when Jake Morrison's logging machine struck something that shouldn't have been there. The blade of his excavator hit metal with a screech that cut through the morning air like a scream. Morrison had been working these woods for 20 years, clearing timber for the state forestry department. He knew every rock, every root, every inch of this terrain. This was different. When the dust settled and Morrison climbed down to investigate, he found himself staring at a piece of rusted steel protruding from the earth. Not a pipe. Not debris. Something deliberately placed, deliberately hidden. Morrison called his supervisor, who called the county sheriff, who called the state police. By noon, the quiet forest was alive with the sound of engines, radios crackling, and the steady scrape of shovels against soil. What they unearthed was not just a container. It was a prison. A carefully constructed underground chamber, reinforced with steel, equipped with ventilation systems, and furnished with the remnants of young lives. Inside, investigators found bunk beds with rotting mattresses. Magazines from the 1990s. Toys that had once brought joy to children. And scattered among the debris, unmistakable evidence of the 3 girls who had disappeared 13 years ago, Girl Scout badges, hair ribbons, and a water-damaged photograph of 3 smiling faces. The silence was finally broken. But the questions that emerged would prove even more haunting than the years of not knowing. Who had built this underground prison? How long had the girls been kept alive down there? And why had it taken 13 years for anyone to find them? July 15, 1996, dawned bright and clear in the small town of Millbrook. For most residents, it was just another summer morning. For 3 10-year-old Girl Scouts, it was the day they had been looking forward to all month. Sarah Chen was the leader of their little trio, the one who always had a plan and the confidence to execute it. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 5, and Sarah had embraced American childhood with the enthusiasm of someone who understood how precious freedom could be. She collected merit badges like other kids collected baseball cards, and she had already announced her intention to become the youngest Eagle Scout in Millbrook's history, even though Girl Scouts didn't have Eagle Scouts. Emma Rodriguez was the dreamer, always sketching in her notebook, always seeing beauty where others saw ordinary things. Her drawings covered her bedroom walls, horses running through meadows, castles floating on clouds, and always, somewhere in the corner, 3 girls holding hands. Emma's mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but she never missed a Girl Scout meeting or camping trip. Mija, she would say, dreams are free, but they're worth more than gold. Katie Sullivan was the quiet one, the observer, the girl who remembered everything everyone else forgot. She could tell you exactly what someone had worn to school 3 weeks ago, or which teacher had seemed sad during lunch duty. Her father was the town's only dentist, and Katie had inherited his attention to detail and his gentle way of making people feel comfortable. The 3 girls had been inseparable since kindergarten, and joining Girl Scouts together in 4th grade had felt like the natural next step in their friendship. They earned badges together, sold cookies together, and planned their futures together. On this particular morning, they were heading to Pine Ridge Forest for an overnight camping trip with their troop. Troop 472 consisted of 12 girls and 3 adult leaders. Mrs. Patterson, the troop leader, had organized the camping trip as a chance for the girls to earn their outdoor skills badges and enjoy the last weeks of summer vacation. The plan was simple: set up camp, practice knot tying and compass reading, prepare meals over a camp stove, and spend the evening around a campfire sharing stories and roasted marshmallows. The morning activities went perfectly. Sarah mastered the bowline knot on her first try. Emma filled 3 pages of her sketchbook with drawings of wildflowers and forest creatures. Katie helped the younger scouts identify different types of leaves and animal tracks. As the day progressed, dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. Mrs. Patterson checked her weather radio and frowned. A severe thunderstorm was approaching, moving faster than the forecast had predicted. At 3:30 p.m., she made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Pack it up, girls," she announced. "We need to get back to town before this storm hits." The disappointment was immediate and vocal. The girls had been looking forward to the campfire stories, to sleeping under the stars, to proving they were brave enough to spend a night in the woods. But Mrs. Patterson was firm. Safety came first. As the troop packed their gear and prepared to leave, Sarah, Emma, and Katie huddled together near the edge of the campsite. They had spotted something earlier during their nature walk, a small cave opening about a quarter-mile deeper into the forest. They had agreed to explore it after dark, once the adults were distracted with campfire duties. Now their adventure was being cut short by a few raindrops and some thunder. "We could go now," Sarah whispered. "Just for a few minutes. We could see what's in the cave and be back before anyone notices." Emma bit her lip, glancing toward the darkening sky. "What if we get caught in the storm?" "It's just rain," Sarah said. "We're Girl Scouts. We're supposed to be prepared for anything." Katie said nothing, but she nodded when Sarah looked at her. The three girls had never broken a rule, never disobeyed their parents, never done anything more rebellious than stay up past bedtime. This felt like their chance to have a real adventure, to prove they were growing up. As the other scouts loaded into the cars with their parents, Sarah, Emma, and Katie slipped away into the trees. They told themselves they would be back in 20 minutes, 30 at most. They told themselves no one would even notice they were gone. They were wrong on both counts. When Mrs. Patterson did her final head count at the parking area, she came up short. 3 girls were missing. She called their names, sent the other parents to search the immediate area, and felt her heart rate climbing as the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the forest. By the time the storm broke over Pine Ridge Forest with the fury of nature unleashed, Sarah, Emma, and Katie were gone. The cave opening was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for the 3 girls to squeeze through one at a time. Sarah went first, as always, using her flashlight to illuminate the narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber beyond. "It's like a secret room," she called back to the others, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Emma squeezed through next, immediately pulling out her sketchbook to capture the rough stone walls and the way Sarah's flashlight created dancing shadows. "This is so cool. We have to come back here again." Katie came last, methodical as always, making sure she could easily find her way back to the entrance. Something about the cave made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was the smell, musty and wrong somehow. Maybe it was the way their voices sounded different in here, smaller and more frightened than they had intended. The girls spent 15 minutes exploring the cave, which turned out to be disappointingly shallow and empty. No hidden treasures, no ancient artifacts, no signs that Native Americans or pioneers had ever used it for shelter. Just cold stone and the increasingly loud sound of rain beginning to fall outside. "We should head back," Katie said, glancing toward the entrance. Through the narrow opening, she could see that the daylight had taken on an ominous green tint. "Just a few more minutes," Sarah said, but even she was starting to feel uneasy. The rain was coming down harder now, and she could hear thunder getting closer. Emma had stopped sketching and was staring at something on the ground near the back of the cave. "What's this?" she asked, kneeling down to examine what looked like a piece of metal partially buried in the dirt floor. Sarah and Katie joined her, and Sarah directed her flashlight beam at Emma's discovery. It was definitely metal, rusty and old, but with a regular shape that suggested it wasn't natural. "Maybe it's from pioneers," Emma suggested. "Like a horseshoe or a buckle or something." Katie touched it gently with her finger, then recoiled. "It feels weird. Kind of sticky." That's when they heard the footsteps. Heavy boots on stone, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system than they had realized existed. The girls froze, suddenly understanding that they were not alone and had not been alone since. Mrs. Patterson's hands shook as she dialed 911 for the second time in 10 minutes. The first call had been to report 3 missing Girl Scouts. This second call was to provide additional information that made her stomach churn with guilt and fear. "The storm is getting worse," she told the dispatcher. "They've been missing for over an hour now. They're just little girls." Sheriff Tom Bradley had been in law enforcement for 15 years, and he had handled his share of missing persons cases. Most of them ended with embarrassed teenagers being driven home by their parents, or elderly folks with dementia being found safe at a neighbor's house. But missing children in a severe thunderstorm was a different category of emergency entirely. By 6 p.m., Bradley had activated the county's emergency response protocol. The state police were notified, search and rescue teams were put on standby, and volunteers were beginning to gather at the Pine Ridge Forest parking area despite the ongoing storm. The first priority was getting detailed information about the missing girls. Bradley interviewed Mrs. Patterson and the other troop leaders, learning everything he could about Sarah, Emma, and Katie, their personalities, their experience level in the outdoors, their likely behavior in an emergency situation. Mrs. Patterson was devastated. "They were good girls," she kept repeating. "They never caused trouble. They must have gotten lost when we were packing up. I should have done a better count. I should have made sure everyone was accounted for before we started loading the cars." The other parents were more direct in their accusations, though Bradley tried to keep the focus on finding the girls rather than assigning blame. There would be time for that later, after Sarah, Emma, and Katie were safely home. Dr. Sullivan, Katie's father, had arrived within minutes of receiving Mrs. Patterson's phone call. He was a methodical man by nature and training, and he immediately began organizing a systematic search plan. "We need to think like 10-year-olds, he told the gathering volunteers. Where would they go? What would seem interesting or exciting to them? Maria Rodriguez, Emma's mother, was less organized in her approach but no less determined. She had borrowed a flashlight and rain gear from one of the other parents and was ready to search every square inch of the forest if necessary. Emma is afraid of the dark, she told anyone who would listen. She'll be so scared out there. The Chen family arrived in force, both parents, 2 uncles, and Sarah's teenage brother David. They brought their own flashlights, first aid supplies, and a grim determination to find their daughter. Mr. Chen had experience with search and rescue from his time in the Taiwanese military, and he quickly positioned himself as one of the volunteer coordinators. As the evening wore on, the search operation grew in size and organization. The state police brought in tracking dogs and helicopter support, though the ongoing storm made aerial searches impossible. Volunteer fire departments from 3 surrounding towns responded with additional personnel and equipment. The search teams divided the forest into grid sections, with each team responsible for thoroughly covering their assigned area. They called the girls' names constantly, hoping to hear a response over the sound of wind and rain. They searched every cave, every overhang, every place where 3 frightened children might have taken shelter. By midnight, more than 200 people were involved in the search effort. They had covered most of the accessible areas around the Girl Scout campsite without finding any trace of the missing girls. The first clue came at 2:30 a.m. when a volunteer searcher named Bill Hayes found a Girl Scout sash hanging from a tree branch about half a mile northeast of the campsite. The sash belonged to Sarah Chen, and it showed signs of having been torn from her uniform rather than removed intentionally. An hour later, another searcher found a broken shoelace that matched the sneakers Katie Sullivan had been wearing. The lace was caught on a thorny bush, and there were small drops of blood on the surrounding leaves. These discoveries gave the search teams a direction to focus on, but they also raised troubling questions. Why were the girls' belongings scattered over such a wide area? Why would Sarah have removed her Girl Scout sash, something she was always proud to wear? As dawn broke over the forest on July 16th, the search continued with renewed intensity but growing concern. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of fallen trees, flooding, and muddy terrain that made tracking nearly impossible. Sheriff Bradley called a press conference at 8 a.m. to provide an update to the media and the community. The story had already been picked up by regional news outlets, and reporters were beginning to arrive in Millbrook. "We have more than 300 people involved in the search effort," Bradley announced. "We're using every resource available to us, including helicopters, tracking dogs, and volunteers from across the region. We're going to find these girls and bring them home." But privately, Bradley was beginning to fear the worst. In his experience, missing children who weren't found within the first 24 hours were unlikely to be found alive. The forest was vast, the terrain was treacherous after the storm, and 3 10-year-old girls would not survive long in the wilderness without proper shelter and supplies. Dr. Sullivan approached the sheriff after the press conference, his face gray with exhaustion and worry. "What aren't you telling us?" he asked quietly. "What do you really think happened to them?" Bradley looked at this father, this man whose daughter might never come home, and struggled to find words that were honest but not hopeless. "I think they got lost in the storm," he said finally. "I think they're probably injured, probably scared, but I think they're fighters. And I think we're going to find them." It was a lie, and both men knew it. But sometimes lies were all that stood between a parent and complete despair. The search would continue for 6 more weeks, involving the memorial service was held on a gray October morning in 1996, 3 months after the girls disappeared. The families had resisted holding it for as long as possible, clinging to the hope that their daughters might still be found alive. But the community needed closure, and the parents needed a place to focus their grief. Millbrook Methodist Church was packed beyond capacity. The entire town seemed to have turned out, along with reporters from regional newspapers and television stations. 3 empty caskets sat at the front of the church, each draped with a Girl Scout flag and surrounded by photographs of smiling, vibrant young faces. Pastor Williams, who had baptized all 3 girls, struggled through a sermon about faith in the face of unimaginable loss. "We may not understand God's plan," he said, his voice breaking. "But we must trust that Sarah, Emma, and Katie are safe in his arms now." The Chen family sat in the front row, stoic and dignified in their grief. Sarah's mother clutched a photograph of her daughter receiving a perfect attendance award at school. Her father held Sarah's collection of Girl Scout badges, each one a testament to her determination and enthusiasm. Maria Rodriguez wept openly throughout the service, supported by her sisters and her mother. Emma's sketchbook lay open on her lap, displaying the last drawing Emma had ever completed, 3 girls holding hands under a rainbow. The Sullivans sat quietly, Dr. Sullivan's arm around his wife's shoulders as she stared at the empty casket that should have contained their daughter. Katie's younger brother, only 8 years old, kept asking in a whisper when Katie was coming home. After the service, the community established the Sarah, Emma, and Katie Memorial Fund to support search and rescue efforts for missing children. A small park was dedicated in their honor, with 3 oak trees planted side by side and a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of 3 bright lights that will never be extinguished." But memorials and tree plantings could not fill the void left by the girls' disappearance, and the questions that haunted the investigation grew more troubling with time. Sheriff Bradley retired in 1999, tormented by his failure to solve the case. His replacement, Sheriff Janet Morrison, no relation to the logger who would later make the discovery, inherited a file cabinet full of leads that had gone nowhere and theories that had fallen apart under scrutiny. The FBI had been involved from the beginning, sending specialists in child abduction cases and experts in wilderness search techniques. They had interviewed hundreds of people, run background checks on every adult who had been in the forest that day, and followed up on tips from across the country. Nothing had yielded concrete results. One theory that gained traction in the early months was that the girls had been swept away by flash flooding. The storm that night had produced several inches of rain in a short period, and some of the forest's normally dry creek beds had become raging torrents. But extensive searches of downstream areas had found no bodies, no clothing, no evidence that the girls had ever been near the water. Another theory suggested that the girls had been attacked by wild animals. Black bears were common in the region, and a frightened or hungry bear might have seen 3 small children as prey. But again, no physical evidence supported this possibility. Bears typically left traces of their kills, and the scattered pieces of clothing found during the search showed no signs of animal damage. The most disturbing theory, and the one that law enforcement officials discussed only among themselves, was that the girls had been abducted by a human predator. The fact that no bodies had been found despite an extensive search suggested that someone had removed the girls from the forest, either alive or dead. This possibility led to investigations of known sex offenders in the region, background checks on all the adult volunteers who had participated in the search, and reviews of similar cases in neighboring states. Federal databases were searched for patterns that might connect the Millbrook disappearances to other crimes against children. Several persons of interest were identified and interviewed, but none of the leads resulted in charges or arrests. The most promising suspect was a drifter named Clayton Morris who had been seen in the area on the day the girls disappeared. Morris had a history of child molestation convictions and no alibi for the evening of July 15. But he had passed 2 polygraph tests and had cooperated fully with investigators, even allowing them to search his vehicle and temporary campsite. Morris left the area in August 1996 and was later arrested on unrelated charges in Florida. He died in prison in 2001. In 2007, Kowalski convinced his department to bring in a specialist in geographic profiling, a technique used to analyze crime patterns and predict where an offender might live or work. The analysis suggested that if the girls had been abducted, their captor was likely someone familiar with the forest, possibly someone who lived or worked in the area. This led to renewed focus on local residents and workers who had access to the forest: park rangers, utility workers, logging company employees, and maintenance staff. Background checks were repeated, alibis were re-examined, and several individuals were re-interviewed. One name that kept appearing in the files was Orson Blythe, an HVAC technician who had done contract work for the State Forestry Department. Blythe had been briefly questioned during the original investigation but had been cleared when he produced receipts showing he had been working in the county seat, 30 miles away, on the day the girls disappeared. In 2008, Kowalski decided to take another look at Blythe's alibi. The receipts were legitimate, but they only covered his morning work. There was a gap in his documented activities from 2 p.m. until the following morning, a gap that coincided perfectly with the time the girls had disappeared. Kowalski began building a file on Orson Blythe, but he would need much more evidence before he could justify another official investigation. He had no idea that evidence was literally buried beneath his feet, waiting for a logger's machine to uncover the truth. The 13th anniversary of the disappearance came and went with the usual vigil and the usual lack of answers. Maria Rodriguez, now graying and worn by years of grief, lit 3 candles and whispered the same prayer she had spoken every night for 13 years, "Please, God, let me know what happened to my baby girl." 2 months later, Jake Morrison's excavator would provide that answer. The call came into Sheriff Morrison's office at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September 2009. Jake Morrison, no relation to the sheriff, was calling from his cell phone, his voice tight with an emotion that might have been fear or excitement or both. "Sheriff, this is Jake Morrison with Millbrook Logging. I'm out here at Site 7 in Pine Ridge, and I've hit something with my excavator. Something that ain't supposed to be here." Sheriff Morrison had taken dozens of similar calls over her 10 years in office. Construction workers and loggers regularly unearthed old septic tanks, forgotten cemetery sites, and buried debris from decades past. Usually these discoveries resulted in a few hours of paperwork and nothing more. But something in Morrison's voice made the sheriff pay closer attention. "What kind of something, Jake?" "Metal. Still, I think. Buried deep, maybe 6 feet down. But sheriff, it ain't random junk. This thing is big, and it's been here a long time. I think someone buried it on purpose." Sheriff Morrison grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Pine Ridge Forest had been the site of the county's most notorious unsolved case, and any discovery there deserved immediate attention. The drive to the logging site took 20 minutes through winding mountain roads. As she approached the work area, Morrison could see Jake's yellow excavator sitting idle next to a partially dug pit. Jake himself was standing well back from the hole, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. "Show me what you found," Morrison said after parking her patrol car. Jake led her to the edge of the excavated area. In the bottom of the pit, partially exposed and crusted with rust and dirt, was a section of steel plating that clearly formed part of a larger structure buried beneath the forest floor. "I've been working these woods for 20 years, Jake said. "I know every rock, every root, every piece of old equipment that was ever left out here. This ain't on any of the old maps or surveys. Someone put this here and covered it up." Morrison stared into the pit, her mind immediately jumping to the obvious conclusion. 13 years ago, 3 little girls had vanished from these woods without a trace. Now something large and deliberately concealed had been discovered buried in the same area. "Jake, I need you to stop all work in this area immediately," she said. "This is now a crime scene until we determine what we're dealing with." Morrison's next calls were to the state police and the FBI field office in the regional capital. Within 2 hours, Pine Ridge Forest was once again crawling with law enforcement personnel, just as it had been on that terrible night in 1996. Detective Ray Kowalski was among the first to arrive. He had been working the cold case for 6 years, and he approached the excavation site with the grim excitement of a hunter who finally sees tracks after a long, fruitless search. FBI Special Agent Linda Chin, no relation to Sarah, brought a team of technicians equipped with ground-penetrating radar and other specialized equipment. The irony of her name was not lost on anyone present, and she worked with particular intensity, knowing that one of the missing girls had shared her surname. The radar imaging revealed the full scope of what lay buried beneath the forest floor. The steel structure was roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet deep. It had been carefully positioned in a natural depression and covered with layers of soil and organic matter that had allowed trees and underbrush to grow naturally above it over the past 13 years. "This isn't amateur work," Agent Chin observed as she studied the radar printouts. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. They wanted it hidden permanently." The excavation proceeded slowly and carefully, with every shovelful of dirt being sifted for evidence. By evening, the full outline of the structure was visible, a rectangular steel box, heavily reinforced, with a hinged access hatch at one end. The hatch was secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted nearly solid over the years. Bolt cutters were required to break the lock, and even then it took considerable effort to force the hatch open. The smell that emerged from the underground chamber was indescribable, a mixture of decay, mold, and something sweetly horrific that made several investigators step back and cover their faces. Agent Chen was the first to descend into the chamber with a flashlight and camera. What she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her career. The space had been furnished like a bizarre recreation of a child's bedroom. 3 small beds lined one wall, each with a moldy mattress and rotting blankets. A shelf held children's books and magazines, all from the mid-1990s. Toys were scattered across the floor, dolls, board games, and art supplies. But these innocent items were overshadowed by more sinister discoveries. Heavy chains were bolted to the walls near each bed. The chamber's ventilation system was elaborate and well-designed, suggesting that it had been built to sustain life for extended periods. And most chilling of all, scratches in the metal walls showed where small fingernails had clawed desperately at the steel in futile attempts to escape. Personal items confirmed what everyone already suspected. Sarah had noted that the man often smelled of machine oil and metal shavings. He had mentioned working on big buildings and complained about fixing other people's mistakes. Most significantly, he had once referred to himself as someone who keeps people comfortable, a phrase that would take on new meaning when investigators finally identified him. As the forensic analysis continued, Agent Chen coordinated with the original investigation files from 1996. Detective Kowalski's meticulous record-keeping proved invaluable as the current investigators cross-referenced new evidence with old witness statements and suspect interviews. One name that kept appearing in both investigations was Orson Blythe, the HVAC technician who had been briefly questioned in 1996 but cleared based on his alibi for the day of the disappearance. "We need to take another look at Blythe," Agent Chen announced at the daily task force briefing. His expertise matches the technical knowledge demonstrated in the chamber's construction, and he had legitimate reasons to be in the forest area for his work. But before they could focus on any individual suspect, the forensic accounting team made a breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. Agent Martinez called an emergency meeting on October 15th, exactly 1 month after the chamber's discovery. She had spent weeks tracking serial numbers and sales records, and her investigation had finally yielded results. "I've identified the source of the ventilation fans," Martinez announced. 3 industrial exhaust fans, purchased from Hartwell Industrial Supply in June 1996. Cash transaction, no credit record, but the buyer had to provide a name for the warranty registration. The room fell silent as Martinez opened her folder and read the name that would finally put an end to 13 years of questions and grief. Orson Blythe, HVAC contractor, licensed in 3 counties, with a work history that includes jobs throughout Pine Ridge Forest. The hunt for the man who had built the underground chamber was finally beginning in earnest. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had seen many crime scenes, but the underground chamber in Pine Ridge Forest presented unique challenges. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity, but rather the product of careful planning, significant financial resources, and technical expertise that suggested the perpetrator had specialized knowledge. Special Agent Dr. Marcus Webb, the unit's chief profiler, arrived from Quantico 3 days after the chamber's discovery. Webb had worked on some of the most notorious child abduction cases in FBI history, but the Pine Ridge Chamber represented something he had never encountered before. "This isn't typical predatory behavior," Webb explained to the assembled task force. "Most child abductors are impulsive, disorganized, driven by immediate gratification. This person spent months, possibly years, planning and constructing this facility. They invested significant time and money in creating what they believed would be a permanent solution to their desires." The technical aspects of the chamber were particularly revealing. The ventilation system was not a crude pipe to the surface, but rather a sophisticated network of intake and exhaust vents hidden among the forest undergrowth. The air circulation was powered by solar panels camouflaged as rock formations, with battery backup systems to ensure continuous operation. The chamber's electrical system included lighting, a small refrigeration unit, and even a basic intercom system that would have allowed the captor to communicate with the victims without entering the chamber. Everything had been designed with the assumption that the imprisonment would last for years. FBI forensic engineer Thomas Hartley led the technical analysis of the chamber's construction. Hartley had spent 15 years analyzing crime scenes involving sophisticated criminal engineering, from elaborate bank vault breaks to terrorist bomb construction. Whoever built this had professional-level knowledge of HVAC systems, Hartley reported to the task force. The air circulation alone would have required understanding of airflow dynamics, moisture control, and filtration systems. This isn't something you learn from internet searches or DIY manuals. The construction materials provided additional clues. The steel plating was industrial grade, the type used in commercial construction projects rather than residential applications. The welding work was professional quality, suggesting the builder had access to commercial welding equipment and the expertise to use it properly. Most significantly, the chamber's ventilation components bore manufacturer serial numbers that had survived 13 years of burial. These numbers would prove to be the key to identifying the monster who had built this underground prison. Hartley's team cataloged every component they could identify. Industrial fans designed for factory ventilation systems, specialized air filters used in hospital clean rooms, humidity control equipment typically found in commercial food storage facilities, and electrical components rated for harsh environmental conditions. These aren't parts you buy at the local hardware store, Hartley explained. Most of this equipment would have been ordered from specialized industrial suppliers, probably with significant lead times for delivery. Someone planned this construction project well in advance. The FBI's forensic accounting team, led by Special Agent Sarah Martinez, began the painstaking process of tracking down the origins of these specialized components. Working with manufacturers and distributors across the region, they requested sales records going back to the mid-1990s. The process was complicated by the age of the records, changes in company ownership, and the fact that many transactions from that era had not been digitized. Agents spent weeks reviewing microfilm archives, paper filing systems, and backup computer tapes from companies that had supplied industrial HVAC equipment in the 1990s. Meanwhile, forensic pathologist Dr. Jennifer Kim was conducting a different type of investigation inside the chamber itself. Kim specialized in analyzing crime scenes for biological evidence, and the underground prison contained 13 years' worth of traces that could tell the story of what had happened there. The girls were kept in this chamber for an extended period, Dr. Kim reported. I've found hair samples from all 3 victims, along with DNA evidence that confirms their presence here. The distribution of biological material suggests they were given some freedom of movement within the chamber, at least initially. More disturbing were the indications of the captor's presence in the chamber. DNA evidence showed that an adult male had spent considerable time in the underground space, and the pattern of evidence suggested regular visits over a period of months or years. He didn't just imprison them and walk away, Dr. Kim explained grimly. He was actively involved in their captivity, visiting regularly, bringing supplies, maintaining the systems. This was an ongoing relationship in his mind, not just a kidnapping. The psychological implications were horrifying. The 3 girls had not simply been abandoned to die in an underground tomb. They had been kept alive, sustained, and probably tormented by their captor over an extended period of time. Emma's sketchbook provided the most heartbreaking evidence of this prolonged captivity. Her drawings showed a progression from initial hope and defiance to gradual despair. Early sketches depicted escape plans, maps of the chamber, and pictures of her parents and friends. Later drawings became increasingly dark and abstract, showing her mental deterioration under the stress of prolonged imprisonment. One drawing, dated nearly 18 months after the girl's disappearance, showed a man's figure standing over 3 smaller figures lying on beds. The man's face was scratched out with such violence that Emma had torn through the paper, but his body shape and clothing were clearly depicted. She was trying to document what was happening to them, Dr. Kim observed. Even under these conditions, she was fighting back the only way she could. Katie's silver cross necklace told another part of the story. Forensic analysis revealed that the chain had been broken and repaired multiple times, suggesting it had been taken from her and returned repeatedly, possibly as a form of psychological control. Sarah's Girl Scout handbook contained notes written in her careful handwriting, documenting their captor's visits, his behavior patterns, and what appeared to be escape attempts. Sarah had maintained her analytical nature even in captivity, treating her situation like a problem to be solved through careful observation and planning. The final entries in Sarah's notes, dated more than 2 years after the disappearance, were increasingly desperate and fragmented. But they contained details about their captor that would prove crucial to the investigation: his approximate height and build, the sound of his voice, the type of vehicle he drove, and most importantly, references to his work. Sarah had noted that the man often smelled of machine oil and metal shavings. He had mentioned working on big buildings and complained about fixing other people's mistakes. Most significantly, he had once referred to himself as someone who keeps people comfortable, a phrase that would take on new meaning when investigators finally identified him. As the forensic analysis continued, Agent Chen coordinated with the original investigation files from 1996. Detective Kowalski's meticulous record-keeping proved invaluable as the current investigators cross-referenced new evidence with old witness statements and suspect interviews. One name that kept appearing in both investigations was Orson Blythe, the HVAC technician who had been briefly questioned in 1996 but cleared based on his alibi for the day of the disappearance. "We need to take another look at Blythe," Agent Chen announced at the daily task force briefing. His expertise matches the technical knowledge demonstrated in the chamber's construction, and he had legitimate reasons to be in the forest area for his work. But before they could focus on any individual suspect, the forensic accounting team made a breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. Agent Martinez called an emergency meeting on October 15, exactly 1 month after the chamber's discovery. She had spent weeks tracking serial numbers and sales records, and her investigation had finally yielded results. "I've identified the source of the ventilation fans," Martinez announced. 3 industrial exhaust fans, purchased from Hartwell Industrial Supply in June 1996. Cash transaction, no credit record, but the buyer had to provide a name for the warranty registration. The room fell silent as Martinez opened her folder and read the name that would finally put an end to 13 years of questions and grief. Orson Blythe, HVAC contractor, licensed in 3 counties, with a work history that includes jobs throughout Pine Ridge Forest. The hunt for the man who had built the underground chamber was finally beginning in earnest. Agent Martinez's discovery of the ventilation fan purchase records was just the beginning. Once the task force had Orson Blythe's name connected to the chamber's construction, they began systematically tracking every aspect of his life and business activities in the months leading up to the girl's disappearance. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Blythe had been a 34-year-old HVAC contractor in 1996, running a small but successful business that specialized in commercial and industrial climate control systems. His client list included several state facilities, including buildings in and around Pine Ridge Forest. This gave him legitimate reasons to be in the area and familiarity with the terrain where the chamber had been built. Financial records revealed a pattern of suspicious purchases throughout the spring and summer of 1996. In addition to the industrial fans, Blythe had bought steel plating from a metal fabrication company, welding equipment from 3 different suppliers, and electrical components from specialty contractors across 2 states. He was careful not to buy everything from one source, Agent Martinez explained. The purchases were spread out over several months and multiple vendors, probably to avoid attracting attention. But when you put them all together, you can see exactly what he was building. Most damning was the timeline. Blythe had begun purchasing construction materials in March 1996, 4 months before the girls disappeared. The underground chamber had not been a spontaneous response to an opportunity, it had been planned and built in advance, waiting for victims. Detective Kowalski, who had been investigating the cold case for 6 years, felt a mixture of vindication and horror as the evidence mounted against Blythe. "He was on our list from the beginning," Kowalski said. "We interviewed him in 1996, but his alibi checked out. We should have looked deeper." The 1996 alibi was indeed legitimate, for part of the day. Blythe had been working on an air conditioning installation at the county courthouse until 2 p.m. on July 15. His work was documented by signed receipts and time sheets that showed he had completed the job on schedule. But there was a gap in his documented activities from 2 p.m. until the following morning. Blythe had claimed he went home, ate dinner, and spent the evening watching television. Nobody could verify this account, but at the time there had been no reason to question it. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and new evidence, investigators realized that Blythe had deliberately constructed an alibi that covered part of the day while leaving himself free to carry out the abduction during the evening hours when the girls had actually disappeared. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Webb studied Blythe's background for psychological indicators that might have predicted his criminal behavior. What he found was a classic profile of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Blythe had never been married and had no long-term relationships on record. He lived alone in a house he had inherited from his deceased mother, maintaining minimal social connections and presenting himself as a quiet, reliable professional who simply preferred solitude. But deeper investigation revealed disturbing patterns. Blythe had volunteered as an assistant scoutmaster with a local Boy Scout troop in 1994, but had been asked to leave after other leaders became uncomfortable with his intense interest in the younger scouts and his tendency to volunteer for overnight camping trips. He was described as someone who tried too hard to befriend the boys, Dr. Webb reported. Always offering to help with personal problems, always wanting to spend one-on-one time with individual scouts. The adult leaders couldn't point to anything specific he had done wrong, but they all agreed something felt off about his interactions with the children. Similar patterns emerged from other volunteer activities. Blythe had briefly helped with a church youth group, assisted at a community center's after-school program, and volunteered for a summer camp that served disadvantaged children. In each case, he had been politely but firmly asked to step back after concerns were raised about his behavior with the children. None of these incidents had risen to the level of official complaints or police involvement. Blythe had been careful to never cross obvious lines, but his pattern of seeking access to children and then being quietly removed from positions of trust created a clear picture of escalating predatory behavior. The breakthrough in the case came when agents located Blythe's business records from 1996. As a contractor, he had been required to maintain detailed logs of his work locations, equipment rentals, and client interactions. These records had been stored in his garage for 13 years, apparently forgotten. The records showed that Blythe had rented heavy excavation equipment in May 1996, claiming he needed it for a private landscaping project at his home. But neighbors confirmed that no such project had ever been visible at Blythe's residence. More significantly, the equipment rental period coincided exactly with the window when the underground chamber would have been excavated and installed. Blythe had rented the machinery under his business name, using his commercial credit, never imagining that investigators would someday connect these routine business transactions to his horrific crimes. GPS records from the equipment rental company showed that the excavator had been driven to a location in Pine Ridge Forest on 3 separate occasions during the rental period. The coordinates matched almost exactly with the location where Jake Morrison would discover the chamber 13 years later. Agent Chen called a meeting of the task force leadership to review the mounting evidence against Blythe. "We have means, opportunity, and now we have direct physical evidence linking him to the construction of the chamber," she summarized. His expertise matches the technical knowledge required, his business gave him access to the materials and equipment, and his purchases match the components found at the scene. But there was still a crucial gap in their case. They had overwhelming evidence that Blythe had built the chamber, but they still needed to prove that he had actually abducted the girls and held them there. That evidence would come from an unexpected source, Blythe himself. As the investigation intensified, local law enforcement had been quietly monitoring Blythe's current activities. He was still living in the same house, still running his HVAC business, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had become the focus of a major FBI investigation. But on October 20th, 5 days after the task force meeting, Blythe's behavior suddenly changed. Surveillance officers noticed that he had stopped going to work, had canceled several scheduled appointments, and had been seen loading boxes into his truck late at night. License plate readers showed his vehicle traveling toward the interstate at unusual hours. "He knows we're closing in," Agent Chen concluded. "Either someone tipped him off, or he's been monitoring news reports about the investigation." The decision was made to move immediately, before Blythe could disappear. The risk of losing their primary suspect outweighed the benefit of gathering additional evidence. On October 22, 2009, 13 years and 3 months after Sarah, Emma, and Katie disappeared, FBI agents and local law enforcement surrounded Orson Blythe's house with arrest. The pre-dawn raid on Orson Blythe's house began at 5:47 a.m. on October 22, 2009. FBI agents, state police, and local law enforcement had coordinated the operation carefully, surrounding the property and cutting off all escape routes before announcing their presence. Agent Chen stood at the front door with the arrest warrant in her hand, her heart pounding with the knowledge that they were about to confront the man who had destroyed 3 families and terrorized an entire community for 13 years. FBI, we have a warrant, she shouted, pounding on the front door. There was no response from inside the house. Orson Blythe, this is the FBI. Open the door. Still silence. The tactical team used a battering ram to force entry, sweeping through the house room by room with weapons drawn. They found Blythe in his bedroom, sitting calmly on the edge of his bed as if he had been waiting for them. He was a small, unremarkable man of 47, with thinning hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. He looked exactly like what he was, a middle-aged tradesman who could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's coworker, anyone's quiet acquaintance who never caused trouble. Orson Blythe, Agent Chen said, you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Sarah Chen, Emma Rodriguez, and Katie Sullivan. Blythe looked up at her with mild curiosity, as if she had just commented on the weather. I suppose you found my workshop, he said calmly. It was not the response the agents had been expecting. Most suspects denied everything, demanded lawyers, or became emotionally volatile when confronted with serious charges. Blythe's matter-of-fact acceptance suggested either complete sociopathy or relief that his secret had finally been discovered. As Blythe was taken into custody, the search of his house began in earnest. What investigators found in his workshop would provide the final pieces of evidence needed to prove his guilt beyond any doubt. The workshop was located in Blythe's converted garage, filled with the tools and equipment of his HVAC trade. But hidden behind a false wall were filing cabinets containing detailed schematics for the underground chamber, receipts for every piece of equipment and material used in its construction, and photographs documenting the building process. Most disturbing were the personal items that Blythe had apparently kept as trophies, additional Girl Scout badges that had not been found in the chamber, a small purse that had belonged to Emma, and a diary that Katie had been keeping during the weeks before her abduction. But it was another discovery that provided the most chilling insight into Blythe's twisted psychology. Hidden in a locked drawer were dozens of letters addressed to the 3 girls, written in Blythe's careful handwriting over a period of several years after their disappearance. The letters revealed the depth of his delusion and the horror of what the girls had endured in captivity. Blythe had apparently viewed himself as their protector and provider, saving them from what he perceived as the dangers and corruptions of the outside world. My dear Sarah, Emma, and Katie, one letter began, I hope you understand that everything I did was for your own good. The world above is dangerous and cruel, but in our special place, you were safe and loved. The letters described a fantasy relationship where Blythe saw himself as a caring father figure, providing for the girls' needs and protecting them from harm. But they also contained references to punishments for bad behavior and rewards for compliance that made it clear the girls had been subjected to systematic psychological and physical abuse. Agent Chen read through the letters with growing horror and disgust. He actually believed he was doing them a favor, she said to her colleague, Agent Thompson. In his mind, he was their savior, not their captor. The letters also provided crucial details about what had happened to each of the girls during their captivity and, ultimately, how they had died. According to Blythe's own written accounts, Sarah had been the most resistant to captivity. She had repeatedly attempted to escape, tried to damage the chamber's systems, and encouraged Emma and Katie to resist their captor's demands. Her rebellious behavior had eventually led to increasingly harsh punishments. Sarah never accepted her new life with me, one letter read. She filled the other girls' heads with dangerous ideas about escape and rescue. I tried to be patient, but she left me no choice but to discipline her more severely. The final letter referring to Sarah, dated approximately 18 months after the abduction, was chillingly brief. Sarah became too difficult to manage. I had to make a hard decision for the safety of Emma and Katie. Sarah is at peace now. Emma had apparently survived longer, but the psychological trauma of watching Sarah's murder and enduring extended captivity had broken her spirit. Blythe's letters described her becoming increasingly withdrawn and unresponsive, refusing to eat or interact with him. My sweet Emma stopped drawing her beautiful pictures, one letter noted. She wouldn't talk to me anymore, wouldn't even look at me. I think she was too sad about Sarah leaving us. Katie, the youngest and quietest of the three, had apparently survived the longest in Blythe's twisted care. But she too had eventually succumbed to the psychological and physical toll of years in captivity. Little Katie was the best of my girls, Blythe had written. She understood that I was trying to take care of her, trying to give her a better life than she could have had above ground. But even she grew sick and tired, and eventually she joined Sarah and Emma in their final rest. The implications of these letters were clear. All three girls had died in captivity, probably over a period of several years, and Blythe had disposed of their bodies somewhere other than the chamber where they had been imprisoned. During his initial interrogation, Blythe confirmed what the letters had suggested. The girls had died at different times, and he had buried their remains in separate locations throughout the forest. I gave them beautiful funeral services, he told investigators with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used during his arrest. They deserve to be laid to rest properly, with dignity and love. The search for the girls' remains would consume law enforcement resources for weeks to come. But for their families, the confirmation that their daughters were dead was both heartbreaking and, in a strange way, a relief. After 13 years of not knowing, they finally had answers. Dr. Sullivan, Katie's father, was among the first family members to be briefed on Blythe's confession. He listened to the details with the same clinical detachment he brought to his dental practice, but those who knew him could see the devastation in his eyes. "At least we know," he said quietly after the briefing. "At least we know she didn't suffer alone. She had Sarah and Emma with her." Maria Rodriguez was less composed when she learned the details of Emma's captivity and death. She had spent 13 years imagining scenarios where her daughter might still be alive, might still come home someday. The reality of Emma's prolonged suffering and ultimate death was almost impossible to bear. "My baby was calling for me for years," she sobbed to her sister. "She was down there in the dark, waiting for Mama to come save her, and I never found her." The Chen family received the news with the stoic dignity they had maintained throughout the long ordeal. But privately, they were tormented by the knowledge that Sarah's natural leadership and fighting spirit had ultimately led to her being the first to die. "She died trying to save the other girls," Mr. Chen said to his wife. "That's who Sarah was. That's who she'll always be." As news of Blythe's arrest and confession spread through Millbrook, the community struggled to process the revelation that a monster had been living among them for all these years. Blythe had been a familiar face around town, a quiet professional who serviced air conditioners and heating systems in homes and businesses throughout the area. People began recalling interactions with Blythe over the years, searching their memories for signs they might have missed. But the truth was that he had been extraordinarily careful to maintain his facade of normalcy while secretly harboring the most twisted desires imaginable. The case that had haunted Millbrook for 13 years was finally solved. But for the families of Sarah, Emma, and Katie, the legal proceedings were just beginning, and there was still the matter of finding their daughters' remains and bringing them home for proper burial. The interrogation room at the FBI field office was sterile and windowless, designed to create a sense of isolation that would encourage suspects to talk. Orson Blythe sat across from Agent Chen and Detective Kowalski, his hands folded calmly in his lap as if he were attending a business meeting rather than confessing to the murder of 3 children. "Let's start from the beginning, Orson," Agent Chen said, her voice carefully controlled despite the rage she felt toward the man sitting across from her. "Tell us about July 15, 1996. Blythe nodded thoughtfully, as if he had been expecting this question for 13 years. "I had been watching the Girl Scout activities in the forest for several weeks," he began, his tone conversational. "I knew their schedules, knew when they would be there. The storm that evening was fortunate timing." He described stalking the 3 girls as they explored the cave, following them as they fled into the storm, and waiting for the perfect moment to use the chloroform he had prepared in advance. "They were so frightened by the storm," he continued. "When I offered them shelter, they wanted to trust me. Children naturally want to trust adults who promise to help them." The details of the abduction were methodical and planned. Blythe had parked his van on a maintenance road that gave him access to the forest without using the main parking area where other parents and scout leaders might notice his vehicle. He had prepared the chloroform, restraints, and a story about being a forest ranger who was there to help lost children. I told them I would take them to a safe place until the storm passed, Blythe explained. I said their parents had asked me to find them and bring them to safety. They believed me because they wanted to believe me. Agent Chen forced herself to continue asking questions, though every word Blythe spoke made her want to end the interview and let the justice system handle him through more violent means. What happened after you took them to the chamber? I explained the situation to them, Blythe said, as if this were a reasonable response. I told them that their families were in danger, that bad people were looking for them, and that they needed to stay in the safe place I had prepared until it was secure for them to return home. The safe place had been the underground chamber, furnished with children's beds and toys to create the illusion that this was temporary shelter rather than a prison. Blythe had told the girls that he was protecting them, that their parents had asked him to keep them safe, and that they would be reunited with their families soon. How long did they believe your story? Detective Kowalski asked. Sarah figured it out first, Blythe admitted with what sounded almost like admiration. She was very intelligent, very observant. Within a few days, she realized that no one was looking for them the way I had described, and that I had no intention of letting them go. This was when the true horror of the girls' captivity had begun. Once Sarah understood their real situation, she had tried to convince Emma and Katie that they needed to find a way to escape. She had attempted to damage the chamber's ventilation system, had tried to break through the walls, and had constantly defied Blythe's attempts to establish control over them. Sarah was a problem, Blythe said matter-of-factly. She wouldn't accept that I was trying to take care of them. She kept filling the other girls' heads with ideas about escape, about fighting back. She made it impossible for us to have the peaceful family life I had planned. The peaceful family life, Blythe described, was a twisted fantasy where he would visit the girls daily, bringing them food, books, and toys while they lived in grateful captivity. He had envisioned himself as their protector and provider, the father figure they would eventually learn to love and depend on. But Sarah's resistance had destroyed this fantasy. Her constant attempts to escape and her influence on Emma and Katie had turned what Blythe saw as a rescue into a battle of wills. I tried to be patient with her, he continued. I tried different approaches to help her understand that fighting me only made things worse for all of them. But Sarah was stubborn. She wouldn't learn. Agent Chen's hands were clenched in fists under the table. What did you do to Sarah? Blythe was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since the interview began, he showed some emotion. Not guilt or remorse, but something that might have been sadness or disappointment. I had to make a choice, he said finally. Sarah's behavior was becoming dangerous to Emma and Katie. She was encouraging them to hurt themselves trying to escape, to refuse food, to resist the care I was providing. I couldn't let her destroy what I was trying to build with them. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what he was describing. Sometime in late 1997 or early 1998, Blythe had murdered Sarah Chen because she refused to submit to his control. Where is Sarah's body, Orson? Agent Chen asked. I gave her a beautiful service, Blythe replied. She's at rest in a peaceful place in the forest, where the morning sun reaches through the trees. Sarah always loved the morning light. He refused to be more specific about the location, claiming that he wanted to preserve the dignity of Sarah's final resting place. But he did provide enough general information for search teams to begin looking in the areas of Pine Ridge Forest where morning sunlight would penetrate the tree canopy. The loss of Sarah had devastated Emma and Katie. According to Blythe's account, both girls had become increasingly withdrawn and unresponsive after witnessing their friend's murder. Emma stopped drawing, Blythe said with genuine sadness. She had been such a talented artist, always creating beautiful pictures. But after Sarah left us, Emma wouldn't touch her art supplies anymore. She would just sit and stare at the walls. The psychological trauma of prolonged captivity and witnessing murder had broken Emma's spirit. She had apparently stopped eating regularly, stopped interacting with Blythe, and gradually wasted away despite his attempts to care for her. When did Emma die? Detective Kowalski asked. Sometime in 1999, Blythe replied. She had been sick for months, getting thinner and sadder. I tried to help her, tried to bring her favorite foods and comfort her, But she had given up hope. Emma Rodriguez had died of what could only be described as despair, her young mind unable to cope with the horror of her situation and the loss of her best friend. "Where did you bury Emma?" "Near a stream where she used to like to draw pictures of the water," Blythe said. "I thought she would like to hear the sound of running water for eternity." Katie had been alone in the chamber for the final phase of her captivity, the sole survivor of the three friends who had sought adventure in a cave on a stormy July evening. She had endured another year or more in isolation before succumbing to the physical and psychological toll of her imprisonment. "Katie was the gentlest of my girls," Blythe said. "She never fought like Sarah, never withdrew like Emma. She tried to be brave, tried to make the best of our situation. But even Katie couldn't survive indefinitely under those conditions." Katie Sullivan had died sometime in 2000 or 2001, according to Blythe's account. She had been in captivity for approximately 4.5 years, enduring psychological torture that no adult could comprehend, let alone a child. "Katie is buried in a place where wildflowers grow," Blythe said. "She always loved flowers, always picked them to give as gifts. I thought she should rest somewhere beautiful." With the locations of the 3 burial sites established in general terms, Agent Chen moved to the final crucial question of the interview. "After the girls died, why didn't you just leave the area? Why did you stay in Millbrook all these years?" Blythe looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "This is my home," he said simply. "This is where my business is, where my life is. Why would I leave?" The complete disconnect from reality that this response represented was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire interview. Blythe had murdered 3 children, buried their bodies in the forest, and then continued to live and work in the same community for 13 years as if nothing had happened. He had serviced air conditioning systems in the homes of parents who were still grieving for their lost daughters. He had attended community events where vigils were held for the missing girls. He had lived as a neighbor to people whose lives he had destroyed, feeling no guilt, no remorse, no connection between his actions and the suffering he had caused. "I kept their memory alive," Blythe said, as if this explained everything. "I visited their resting places regularly, brought them flowers and small gifts. I made sure they were never forgotten." The interview continued for several more hours, with Blythe providing additional details about the girls' captivity and death. But the essential facts were clear. Sarah, Emma, and Katie had died in the underground chamber over a period of several years, victims of a man whose complete lack of empathy had allowed him to convince himself that he was their protector rather than their destroyer. When the interview finally ended, Agent Chen walked out of the room and immediately sought out the nearest bathroom, where she was violently sick. In 15 years of law enforcement, she had never encountered such a complete absence of human conscience. Detective Kowalski found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at nothing. "How does someone become that?" she asked him. "How does a human being turn into something that can do what he did and feel no guilt about it?" Kowalski had no answer. In 6 years of working the cold case, he had imagined many scenarios for what had happened to the 3 girls. But the reality had been worse than anything he had conceived. The legal proceedings would continue for months, but the essential work was done. They had their confession, they had their evidence, and they had enough information to find the girls' remains and finally bring them home to their families. But for everyone involved in the investigation, the knowledge of what Sarah, Emma, and Katie had endured would be a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. As Judge Martinez pronounced the sentence, Dr. Sullivan felt something he had not experienced since July 15, 1996, peace. His daughter was finally coming home, and the monster who had taken her from them would never hurt another child. Maria Rodriguez wept as she had throughout the long ordeal, but these were different tears. They were tears of grief and relief mixed together, tears that acknowledged both the loss of her daughter and the end of not knowing what had happened to her. The Chen family maintained their composure, but Mr. Chen's hand found his wife's as the judge spoke. Sarah was gone, but she had not been forgotten. Her courage in trying to protect Emma and Katie, even in captivity, had become part of her legacy. Outside the courthouse, the families made a brief statement to the media that had followed the case from the beginning. "We want to thank everyone who never stopped looking for our daughters," Dr. Sullivan said, reading from a prepared statement. The investigators, the volunteers, the community members who kept their memory alive, you made it possible for us to finally bring Sarah, Emma, and Katie home. We also want other families who are facing similar tragedies to know that they should never give up hope, Maria Rodriguez added. It took 13 years, but we finally got our answers. We finally got justice. The statement concluded with an announcement that would ensure the girls' memory lived on in a meaningful way. The families had established the Sarah, Emma, and Katie Foundation, dedicated to supporting search and rescue efforts for missing children and providing resources for families dealing with similar tragedies. As the families walked away from the courthouse together, they carried with them both the weight of their loss and the relief of finally knowing the truth. The long nightmare was over. Their daughters were coming home.